Last September, I reviewed the Rhombus Beta Ripple, and I was so blown away by its playability that I point blank said it was the best paddle I'd ever tried, and all year this year I haven't really felt something quite as shockingly impressive until I tried the Selkirk Project Boomstick. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Now first of all, welcome to the new studio. I'd been using this gray background for a really long time. I figured it was time to upgrade it, so hopefully you guys enjoy it. Now, if you did watch my first impressions video of the Boomstick a couple of weeks ago, you'll know I was very impressed. After my first hit, I was really quite shocked. The paddle was pretty much unlike anything I'd ever tested before. It's a Gen 4, and Gen 4 technology is generally great in most paddles that use it, but it does just feel like Selkirk has taken it a couple steps farther. So as you can imagine, this is going to be a glowing review, but it's not all perfect. Having spent a lot more time on court with it after those first impressions, there are a couple of cons, I guess you could call them, and I'll definitely talk about those throughout the video. Now before we go on, I do just want to remind you, as usual, that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So, before we get into any playability, I do want to go over the Boomstick specs and also the technology, because it's very, very important here. Now, there are two Boomsticks, the Elongated and the Widebody. They're not using their normal naming system with Invicta, Epic, and S2 with these. And that's because these are actually new shapes from Selkirk. Well, at least relatively new. We have seen them on the SLK era powers that came out earlier this year, but I'll start with the specs on the Invicta here. This paddle is 16.5 inches long, it's 16 millimeters thick, but it has a 5.8 inch handle. That's longer than the average 5.5 inch handle we find on most elongated paddles, and it's significantly longer than the Invicta handle, which means more room for two hands for a two-handed backhand, but also less paddle face surface area. That can obviously have an effect on playability like maneuverability, but also sweet spot size, and we will talk about that later. But first, let's just finish up with the weight specs here. This paddle weighs between 8 and 8.3 ounces. It has a 118 swing weight and a 7.2 twist weight. That's a pretty normal swing weight, but actually quite a high twist weight for an elongated paddle. For comparison, the SLK era power, which has the exact same shape, has a twist weight of 6.6, so I want you all to keep that high twist weight in mind. Now the wide body Boomstick I didn't actually play with because I always prefer elongated paddles, but I will read off the specs. This paddle is 15.95 inches long. It also has a 16 millimeter core. It also has a 5.8 inch handle, and it weighs between 8 and 8.4 ounces. The swing weight is 112, and the twist weight is 8.2, which again, when you compare it to the same shape era power, that paddle has a twist weight of 7.3. So these Boomsticks have very, very high twist weights. Now let's talk about why. Well, you can see it right there. These paddles have this very unique perimeter weighting systems on the sides of the paddle at around 10 and 2 o'clock. Selkirk calls this the MOI tuning system, and it's there to expand the sweet spots by making these paddles more torsionally stable. Apparently, Selkirk realized that this was the perfect place to add weight for optimal sweet spot size. They went ahead and did it themselves instead of letting us figure it out with lead tape. But yeah, that explains the high twist weight. For those of you wondering if it's removable, it's kind of confusing. Selkirk says that it's semi-permanent, but then also says that removing it could damage the paddle. So I guess kind of. I don't even know how you'd remove it, but honestly, I wouldn't. It definitely has a positive effect on this paddle's sweet spot size, which I will talk about in a second, and it doesn't even really slow it down all that much. Now, the MOI tuning system is the most visually obvious bit of tech here, but it's certainly not the only thing going on. There's a ton to unpack with the construction here, so I'm going to move on to the core now. I'm going to overlay this picture of the Boomstick's core so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. This is a Gen 4 paddle, so it has a full foam core design, but as you can see, there are two different types of foam. On the inside here, you've got Selkirk's pure foam. That makes up most of the paddle, but then it's fully encased in a different density foam that Selkirk calls the EVA Power Ring. This looks a lot like a Gen 3 core, except instead of a honeycomb core on the inside, it's a foam core, and it also looks a lot like the J2 FC Plus's core. This is the FC Plus's core. They look almost identical. Really interesting stuff. As soon as I saw this core design, I got really excited because some Gen 4s, like the True Foams, lack a bit of power compared to Gen 3s. This almost looks like a combination of a Gen 3 design with a Gen 4. So yeah, I was very excited to try it out. Then finally, you've got Selkirk's Infinigrit on the top sheet. So not just raw carbon, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, that's about it for the technology. Now let's finally get into some playability. Okay, now before we talk about power, spin, and control, we are going to start with feel. I almost wanted to start with power this time because it is so ridiculous, but I'm staying true to these reviews. We're going to start with what that point of contact actually feels like. I do think feel is such an important part of understanding the experience you're going to have with a paddle, and in that first impressions video, I said I was really struggling to put this feel into words, but I think I've got it figured out now. This paddle feels extremely unique, and you'll notice that right away, even before hitting the ball hard. I was just bouncing the ball on the paddle face in the store, and the sound that it makes is insane. It's the loudest paddle I've ever heard, and that applies to both soft shots and when you're hitting the ball hard. Now that's just the sound that it makes. There's also a lot to talk about with the actual ball feel. The first thing you notice is just how powerful that point of contact is. The sound definitely plays a role in giving it that effect, but it's unmistakable. The ball just feels like it shoots off the paddle. Now here's the thing, it's way more powerful than any Gen 4 I've tested, which would make you think, okay, maybe it feels springy like a Gen 3, especially with that construction, but this really feels nothing like any Gen 3. Gen 3s have a long dwell time and feel soft, but instead of that softness cushioning the ball, it acts like a loaded spring. Basically, the deeper the ball goes, the faster it comes out. This feels like it should be springy and hollow like a Gen 3, considering the amount of power that it generates, but it's not. The dwell time here is much shorter, the paddle is more muted, and most importantly, it doesn't feel soft. So it's more powerful, but with what seems to be less of a spring effect than a Gen 3 paddle, which is why it feels so unique to me. It almost doesn't make sense. The one thing I will say is that muted feel could be almost tricking me into thinking the dwell time is shorter than it is, because I'm just not feeling the ball quite as much. But there are some muted Gen 3s like the Proline Energy, and comparing the two, it doesn't feel like the ball spends as much time in the paddle face here. So it's stiffer than most Gen 3s and Gen 4s, still not quite as stiff as Gen 2s. Now I actually want to spend a little bit more time talking about that muted feel, because usually I prefer more feedback, but I really didn't care about it here. The reason I like feedback on a pickleball paddle is because it helps me to find the sweet spot. And the reason I want to find the sweet spot is because that's usually where you get optimal playability out of your paddle. Well, not here. This is an absolutely ridiculous paddle in that regard. I think objectively the sweet spot is its most impressive characteristic. This is by far the biggest sweet spot I've ever felt on any paddle. It almost feels like the whole paddle face is the sweet spot. That's how big it is. I'll play this little clip here that I found pretty funny where I mishit this overhead, and I'll let you listen to the rest.
Right in the sweet spot, right in the sweet spot. You can see, that's how big the sweet spot is.
That's obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but this sweet spot is completely different to others that I've tried. It basically feels like there's no drop off in playability anywhere on the paddle face, at least to a certain extent. There are other paddles with really big sweet spots, like the J2 FC Plus, for example, but with paddles like that, it's more like they're relatively more forgiving outside the sweet spot than other paddles. There's still a pretty stark contrast between good contact and bad contact. Not on the Selkirk Boomstick. This paddle was crazy. There were times where I knew my contact was a little off center, and yet my shot was perfect, and I would just laugh. And once I got used to this, it actually made me more confident to go for more difficult shots. Having a sweet spot this big means you simply don't have to be as precise with your contact. So I was going for some wild passing shots from places I would usually try to slow down the paddle face and make sure I made perfect contact. When I get pushed to my backhand wing, for example, that's not something I'm super comfortable with. So instead of trying to hit a passing shot, I'll hit a drop. Well, I hit some great passing shots here. It was just a really cool experience playing with something this forgiving, and you don't just feel that in the power game, by the way. You also feel that big sweet spot and consistency in the control game. I went back to the SLK era power after about 2 sessions with this paddle, and I just couldn't believe it. And that's a paddle I love, by the way, but I felt like the sweet spot size had shrunk from the size of a melon to the size of a grape. I think obviously the MOI tuning system has something to do with this. Adding mass to the sides of the paddle will always increase the sweet spot size, but I think 90% of it is more so due to just great engineering with the foam from Selkirk, so kudos to them. Now let's move on to power. Okay, so I personally think the most impressive characteristic on this paddle is the sweet spot, but that's more so because I usually don't care about sweet spot size, and this made me care about it. I think most people will find the power to be the most impressive characteristic. The best word I can use to describe the power here is that it is automatic. It is instantaneously powerful, it is consistently powerful, it's just all out power all the time. That instantaneous power is really the main difference between this and a Gen 3 for me, and it makes sense that it has a quicker, powerful feel because it does have a shorter dwell time. Remember, on Gen 3s, the ball sinks into the paddle face to load up on power, but you don't have that sinking sensation here. The ball's quicker in and out of the paddle face, and yet it's got even more power than Gen 3s. I don't fully understand how that's possible. Before using this paddle, I would have told you that I think more dwell time is always better because that's how you get more trampoline effect, but that's not the case here. I think what it is that because of this construction with that EVA power ring on the outside, there's still some sort of trampoline effect. It's just not that noticeable. But then also the pure foam is adding that stiffer foam power. Now, because it doesn't require much dwell time to generate all this power, I think pop is actually a little bit more impressive than all out power. At least it's relatively more impressive. You barely have to generate any paddle head speed and the ball just booms off the paddle face. Here's an anecdote. I played a lot of singles with this paddle, and one of the bad habits that I have when I play singles in pickleball is that I hit more tennis style volleys. Tennis volleys involve a shorter, choppier motion than pickleball volleys. You push the ball back into your opponent's court rather than trying to roll it or pop it in. Basically, you don't swing at the ball in the same way you do in pickleball. The problem with doing that with a quote-unquote normal paddle is that the ball doesn't come off with enough power to really bother your opponent. But this paddle's so poppy that I was getting away with it. The ball just penetrates through the court a lot more. Now, you can also hit proper pickleball volleys with this, don't worry. And when I did, it was awesome for that as well. Just so much extra velocity on those abbreviated swings. Again, you can literally hear it booming off the paddle face. It's honestly kind of scary for your opponent because they know what's coming. So pop is insane, and then you've got full paced power, which was one of the most fun parts of this paddle for me to experiment with, but it is a little bit complicated, and I'm actually going to explain it as part of the spin section because the two are really important to talk about together. The top end power here is absolutely incredible, and once I dialed it in, I was hitting some of the craziest drives I've ever hit on a pickleball court. The thing is, it did take me a second to get used to it because it's very different to the power on a Gen 3, and that's because of the way this paddle spins the ball. Spin isn't just important on a drive, it's necessary because that's how you actually control the ball. So the way the paddle spins it is really important because that basically determines the technique you use on a drive. Gen 3s are obviously extremely powerful, and because they have that long dwell time, you can almost sort of grab onto the ball and shape it and generate ridiculous spin that way. That means you can go for these really big shots with lots of depth that almost surprise your opponent because it feels like they shouldn't drop in, but they do because the RPMs just naturally bring it down really quickly. The Boomstick is different. I was really struggling at first with those big low to high strokes because the dwell time is shorter here. You just don't have the time to scoop the ball with the same technique you use on Gen 3s. When I tried that here, the ball was just popping right out and it was launching high. So at first I thought the spin was kind of lacking, but I could not have been more wrong about that. I tried something new with the Boomstick, something I've never really tried with the pickleball paddle. Instead of scooping at the ball, I tried just tilting the paddle face more, the same way I would on a tennis racket to generate topspin. Now doing that on most paddles would just shoot the ball down because paddles don't have strings, they can't grip onto the ball in the same way. But that didn't happen here. It's one of the craziest things I've felt on a pickleball paddle. The ability to add spin without really needing to use a scooping motion. It's sort of like the first time I tested a Gen 2 and how responsive they were, but it's 10 times more intense here. It's just a crazy combination of spin and power, and that's the key, is that it's more responsive than Gen 3s because the dwell time is shorter. I've actually said before that Gen 3s are the closest thing to a tennis racket, but this is actually more like a tennis racket. Tennis rackets actually don't have as long of a dwell time as Gen 3s. In some ways, you can actually generate more spin on a pickleball paddle with their super long dwell time, but this is a more responsive type of spin than those. You don't have to focus on that point of contact as much. You just swing through the ball and the spin will come, but there is one thing to this whole spin profile. It doesn't perform as well in the soft spin game. The soft spin game requires dwell time because you need the ball to go up really high and then drop really short, which requires dwell time because you really need to just scoop it aggressively. You do that here and it'll generally go too high and you won't have the time to shape it, so it's definitely tougher to use in the soft spin game. But honestly, you don't really need to use soft spin. There's so much power here that you can get away with driving in most situations, which is what I ended up doing, and I really didn't get burned that often. Now, spin up at the net is interesting because in theory, the shorter dwell time should mean that it's not quite as good, but I didn't really feel that way. I'm talking about spin on roll volleys, but also spin when you're dinking, especially on backhand dinks. I actually had a really good time with both those types of shots here. On the backhand dink in particular, I felt like I could, again, just tilt my paddle a little more and I had the purchase I needed to roll it over. And then the same thing with roll volleys, tilt the paddle face and trust that it's going to have the purchase to shape the ball. That's the big thing with this paddle is trust. You just gotta trust it. Using it to its full potential might feel a little bit foreign at first because nothing else really plays this way, but once you do get comfortable with it, you'll be hitting shots you didn't even know you could hit on a pickleball court. Now let's talk about control, because stiffness, power, those aren't really attributes you associate with a good control paddle. And I will be honest, this is not one of the best control paddles out there, but it does have a couple things going for it. Especially the big sweet spot and the consistency here around the paddle face makes it super forgiving in the touch game, at least up at the kitchen. Dinking is where I think a paddle being inherently powerful isn't too big of a deal, because there's less randomness to it compared to drops and resets, so once you're used to the paddle's power, you're fine. And I actually think this is one of the best paddles to dink with. I really didn't have a long learning curve with it, and then when I switched to the Project 008, which is obviously a full-on control paddle, I found myself missing the Boomstick's sweet spot and consistency more than I was appreciating the softness of the 008. Now things are a little bit different once you take a few steps back in the control game. Drops are okay, I still wish I had a bit more dwell time to really guide the ball into the kitchen, but again, once you get used to the power, you should be fine. Resets is where I struggled the most on any shot with this paddle. Resets are more random, because usually that's when your opponent's in control and it's kind of dictating points. You're scrambling, trying to get the ball back into play to reset the point. And that's where having a longer dwell time, and especially that more cushioned feel, is really beneficial. I was definitely popping the ball up more than I wanted to on resets. Now I'm sure I could get used to it in the long run, but it's objectively not great for that. And resets are super important in pickleball. There's no way around that. That's the major flaw with this paddle, even compared to Gen 3s. I much prefer those for resets because they have a longer dwell time and more ball feel, so I just have more of that sensation of control over where I'm putting the ball. So yeah, not the best paddle for control, but once you do get used to its inherently powerful feel, you can absolutely get dialed into it because it's consistent and it has a big sweet spot. And those two things are obviously key characteristics in the control game. Now I do just quickly want to talk about maneuverability, because obviously this shape is very different to the Invicta and this shape is very different to the Epic, and I think it's a super positive change overall. I can't say much about the Widebody, again, because I didn't use it, but with the Elongated, it was just awesome to have this much room for two-handed backhands. There aren't that many paddles out there that have this much room down there. The other thing is that because the handle is longer and the paddle face is shorter, it feels whippier, which is great for hand speed up at the net and also great for generating spin. It feels like you get a bit more easy wrist lag to whip it through that contact point. Now the drawback to all this would theoretically be stability and sweet spot size with less paddle face, but I've already said that's certainly not a problem here. So yeah, just a really well thought out shape, and again, I can't really speak too much on it, but just swinging it around, it feels like it would be a similar story with the Widebody compared to other Widebodies. Very maneuverable, very whippy, and really easy to put two hands on. You know, I usually say these powerful paddles aren't going to be for everyone and that you should be careful when buying them, but I don't really feel that way about the Boomsticks. The reason I always give that warning with power paddles is because of the control game and how important it is, especially when you're learning, and power paddles generally make the control game much more difficult. Now yes, there are easier paddles to use in the control game, but I actually think because the Boomstick is good for dinking and fine for drops with its really big sweet spot and that forgiving feel, it is probably easier to use than the average power paddle. That sweet spot is something I really can't understate. It point blank makes this paddle more forgiving than most others. And then the thing is that it's so powerful and so spin friendly that it really does have crazy potential at the top end, almost to the point where if you are the type of player that wants to play that style of pickleball, I do almost struggle to recommend other paddles. That's without factoring in the price though, which I know is extremely important, but I'm just saying, if price is no object, this is probably the most impressive paddle I've tested in a really long time, so it's also not like they're charging that price with nothing backing it. But again, it is kind of ridiculously expensive. But yeah, with that said, definitely an awesome pickleball paddle, but that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, if you do want to demo the new Selkirk Boomsticks, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.